Hello, my name is Dmitry, and in this video I'm going to demonstrate how you can use Nodus to generate new ideas, to brainstorm, and to think about things using text network visualization. So the text network becomes like a mirror which you use to reflect your ideas and use the different insights from Nodus to help yourself develop these ideas further. I will think about a practice that I'm working on, which is called 8OS, Body-Mind Operating System, which is a body practice made to learn how we can understand concepts in an embodied way. So how we can take complex metaphors, ideas, and experience them through the body in order to learn something new about them, about ourselves, and about dynamics of any interaction. And today I have a few topics that I want to focus on, so I'm just going to demonstrate the workflow that I usually use to think about ideas with Nodus. I'm just going to take it real time, so sometimes if it's slow you can just fast forward, but I thought it would be nice to show it this way so you can see how you can use it with your own ideas. First of all, you need to open the apps page here and then choose this live ideation app, which can be used to just write ideas into the graph. If it's closed, you can open it here and then click the editor pane to start adding stuff. So now I'll just start talking and fantasizing. So the first thing that I want to think about is the notion of tension and release. As you can see, when we type in the words into Nodus, they're visualized as a graph, where the words are the nodes and the co-occurrences are the connections between them. I can add more ideas. Specifically, I'm interested in how tension release can be represented through the body and why it can be interesting aesthetically. See, when I add more ideas, we have the new words that pop up. And now there are two different colors, which represent two different groups of nodes. It's because I used release tension and interested in one context and then represent body interesting in the other. So this is why there are two parts of the graph. And we can also see the most influential elements, which are shown bigger on the graph. Tension, release, body, represent. When we select them, we see the exact idea that contains those words, nodes, and we can also see them here, and we can deselect them to see the whole graph. So this is kind of how it works, basically. And then what I like to do is just to use the graph to generate some ideas that I can then align into something a little bit more meaningful and a little bit more coherent and organized. But at the beginning, it's just nice to start throwing ideas into Nodus, and I will show you which features of the tool and which features of the graph you can use to help yourself think and to develop certain ideas deeper, if you're interested in that, or to rather create a field of very different ideas to have a sort of pool of the possibilities which you can then use to generate some interesting concepts. So here we go, we have the graph, we're talking about tension and release. I can just write simple sentences like tension, release, and embodiment. It can even be ideas, doesn't have to be well-formed sentences. Then I can also throw something in that I like how it looks when the body is moving and we can see the tension and release at the same time, both physically and visually. So here I'm just writing some thoughts I had. And also it's nice now, it just shows the labels for the biggest and most influential nodes, but we can also show the labels for each node, which is nice to do at the beginning. So we can change this default setting. Just go to settings, then scroll here, show node labels for all nodes. Then click save. And when we go back to the graph, which we're creating here, you will see that we have the labels for all the nodes. What's also nice is that the analytics panel here shows the main topics which are forming based on the co-occurrence of those words on a special algorithm that Nodus uses to understand what are the main topical clusters in your discourse, which is great because it gives you a nice overview of what you're thinking about. And then there is a lot more features I will show later. So now we can close it and just continue writing. Let's say that the notion of tension and release is related to the idea of a flow. When there is a flow, there is a certain release. When there is an obstacle to the flow, then there might be tension. How can we represent a flow, a fluid state through the body? The notion of fluidity. So here is just some ideas that I'm throwing into the tool. Let's say at this point, I'm interested to use the graph to see how I can develop these ideas further and make them more coherent. There are a few tools I can use to do that. For example, here it shows me the index of mind viral immunity, which is correlated with the network structure. In this case, it's focused. And if I click here, I can see that it says that the discourse is focused, which means that while there are several perspectives, there is a focus on one, medium diversity. So this is why the immunity of this discourse is medium, because it's not really diverse. And here's a recommendation that to create relevant content, we recommend to either focus on that perspective using the most relevant keywords, so here, the most influential elements, or add the missing content. So for example, I can ask myself, okay, what about release, tension, body flow? What is the relation between all those terms here? The most influential ideas in this discourse. You see, if I click them, they're all selected. Like, all right, so what is the relation between the flow, the release, and the tension? I can say that a wave is a combination of tension and release physically. It is like that. Okay, so here I'm starting to form some new interconnected clusters of nodes. I can select this statement and see, okay, here is a wave, relation flow. So maybe I want to develop this idea a little bit further about the wave. So what is a wave? Scientifically, it is a transfer of energy in a medium. Okay, you see, so we're starting a new discourse here. The mind viral immunity index is low, so it indicates to us that the structure is biased because all the most important and influential elements are tension, release, flow. So even though the discourse is diverse, there is too much focus on these three. And here we have a nice button inside. The recommendation is to develop periphery. What Nodus does at every time, it recommends to you to develop your discourse structurally in an interesting way. If it's too focused, like it is in this way, or even biased, then it recommends you to develop the periphery. If it was too dispersed, it would recommend you to make connections between the dispersed elements. So it always tries to bring this idea of non-equilibrium stability to the discourse, that you can clearly visualize how you're thinking. If your thoughts are all over the place, it's going to recommend to you to connect them together. If you're too much focusing on one thing, it's going to recommend you to explore the new parts and the new interesting ideas. So this is what we're going to do now. We will take this cluster here with the wave, scientific transfer, energy, medium, and try to explore this topic here a little bit. So what about a wave? Wave is a transfer of energy. Wave is also connected to the notion of a flow, because there can be a flow which is representing a certain force, maybe thanks to the force of gravity, but there can also be a flow which represents an impulse. A transfer of energy. See, now it's much more interconnected with the rest of the discourse. The network structure is now focused, so that means it's not anymore biased, so we can still develop here the action advices to diversify, to ask a research question that would link these two topics: flow, represent gravity, and wave, transfer energy. So the easy way to do this is just to ask yourself, okay, what is the relation between the flow, represent gravity, and wave, transfer energy? And if you click here or here, it shows you two statements that you could link with the question or with an answer. And here, in our case, it's what is a wave? Scientifically, it is transfer of energy in a medium, okay? And then there's another statement that it's a connection to the notion of a flow, because it can be a flow. So how can you transfer energy in a flow? We can even write this: transfer energy within a flow. A wave is something that can change the flow, the direction or the force or the energy within. It can also create an obstacle for a flow. Okay, we add this. So now we're really expanding on the subject. And here it's time to maybe deselect this so we can see all the nodes and just look at the graph and see what else we could explore. Now we're too much focused on the flow, and if the idea is to really lay out all the different ideas and to represent the discourse to its fullest, I would start looking at the smallest nodes, like the body, the notion, fluidity. Interesting. By the way, you can also do that if you just go here into the essence, then you have the most influential elements, and you know that you're talking about flow, release, tension, represent. So you can click this button and remove all those most influential elements from the graph to see what else is hiding behind them. Here we can actually do it in a few iterations. So okay, we also need to talk about the body and the fluidity and the force. You can even go into the inside panel, see what is recommended here. So for instance, let's focus on the body. Let's get all those elements back into the graph here. And once again, and then let's focus on this body notion, the notion of the body. Why are we interested in that idea of a wave in the body? How can a wave be represented in a body? For example, through a collective body. How the bodies can interact and transfer energy and impulses from one another. For example, this can be interesting. Okay. Also, the body is the medium through which physical energy is transferred. Okay. Then it also makes me think, I can click on the nodes and see what it's connected to and also reveal what it's not connected to. So for instance, somewhere before we talked about the notion of gravity here, and it's not yet connected to the notion of the body. So we can click on those two nodes and see how they could be related. So energy, body represent flow. So the body represents the flow of gravity. Or how can the body represent the flow of energy related to the force of gravity? Add this into the graph, connect the two together, so now we see the body is becoming much more influential. Then click on the Insight panel, look at the advice. So you see we're still too much focused on the idea of the flow, release, and the recommendation is to diversify. If we click here, we will see that the discourse structure is focused and its immunity is low, which means it may be easier to infiltrate than when it's not focused. While it has several perspectives, it is focused on only one. You can make it more diversified and thus more immune if you identify the less developed clusters in the graph and make connections between them. That's where the new ideas may be. For example, between these two topics below. Energy transfer impulse and body state interact. So I can again click on the button, reveal the gap. Here we will see the two statements that we can link with an interesting new idea or a research question. And really, this approach is based on detecting what is the structural gap in the network. So which two clusters could be better connected but are not yet. And this comes from the social sciences theory, which represents how we can identify two groups of people, for example, and see what could be an interesting way to strategically position ourselves between these two groups in order to generate some new interesting connections, which could lead to innovations or new ideas. And in this case, we're just transferring this theory of structural holes into text discourse networks in order to identify the clusters of nodes which are interconnected but are not yet related to each other, and then thinking how could we link them better with some interesting ideas. And usually when you do that, it just leads to those eureka moments that you generate new ideas because you start thinking about things that are relevant but that are surprising because you haven't thought of them before in the same way. So this is what we're going to do now. We will think of the connection between the body, state, interact, and energy transfer impulse. And here we have those statements to link. So how can we represent the flow, a fluid state through the body, and wave as the connection? Okay, so how do we represent the flow through the body and the notion of fluidity in the body? And then energy as a transfer of impulse. So maybe a flow of energy can be represented through an impulse. A moment of tension, what we talked about earlier, and what we started from actually, this interest in tension and release. Moment of tension and the moment of release. Those two combined can reveal the forces which are acting on the body, and thus reveal both the gravity and also the intention, because if you think about it, we're only responding either to the force of gravity or to the intention. So in this case, we're just thinking of both of them together. So the force of gravity, the energy, the representation of the flow. Let's see what we can add further into this brainstorm of ideas. Energy transfer revealed the body. So how can we reveal the energy transfer through the body? Let's say we already talked about a communal body, so several bodies acting on each other as a way of representing both gravity and intention and external forces, but also within one body, the transfer of impulse can be represented with tension followed by a release, directed tension, so we can see where it's going, so we can see the direction of the flow. And here is how we can represent fluidity through the body, through a combination of tension and release to amplify the aesthetics sense of liquid nature of things. Okay, so now we have a much more diverse discourse, but it's still quite focused on the flow, tension, and release. So let's try to explore the periphery, how it's advised here, diversify. It says that we can again try to focus on making the links between here, force of gravity, and flow, wave, motion. So for example, we can say that a flow of water, let's say, happens because of gravity. When we see a flow, it's because force of gravity is acting on the water and it's going downwards, for example. At the same time, if we are in zero gravity, then there is no flow. So the only way to make water move is to give it an external impulse. But when we give it an impulse, it's going to move as an integral entity. So it's densely interconnected and the molecules are binding to each other like a swarm, and this makes them move as a collective of distinct individuals, of exploring this idea here. Okay, maybe it's nice to explore a bit on this cluster here, just talking about the swarm. For instance, you know, what a swarm is. A swarm as a combination of elements which follow the same rules, simple rules, and exhibit complex behaviors as a collective. Let's say even emergent behaviors. So then we can again undo the select here so we can see all the nodes and then explore a little bit more this topic here, swarm rules. So for example, what rules can make swarm move as an entity and exhibit liquid pattern. For instance, the bird swarms are following a few simple rules, like stay close to each other, follow the direction of the one going in front, and then they align into complex patterns, and if there is an obstacle, they change the direction. So as you can see now, the mind bar luminosity is high and the structure is diversified. So now we finally have really diverse structure. We can actually go back into settings and remove the labels for all the nodes, because it's going to look a little bit clearer here now that we have quite a few stuff added. Go back into the graph. Okay, so now we see that it's about the flow, the body, release, tension, represent, move. So all the most important stuff are there, and we even have this nice topical group which is talking about swarms and the movement that a swarm is making. So the interesting thing here is that just by looking at the graph, we can also start making interesting connections. Let's say, what is the relation between the swarms and the rules that they follow? Okay. What are the different rules that swarms can follow, and how can we represent them in a way that is embodied through the body? What are the aesthetic implications of that? Okay, add this idea, develop this part a little bit further, and then maybe also a little bit better connection with tension and release, because it's two quite important nodes, but they're not connected to swarm. So what would be the relation between tension and release? Maybe the different speeds and intensities of swarm movement can be visible when we see them contract, tension, and expand, release. These moments allow us to actually notice those swarms in space, because they change the behaviors. Okay, add this, so it becomes more diverse. And then at this point, what can also be nice to do is to delete some nodes. Let's say get rid of tension, release, represent body. We know that we're talking about tension, release, body representation, flow, and then see what's hiding behind them. So we already talked about the swarm quite a lot, moving entities, impulse. Okay, so this is a nice way to reveal the latent topics which are important but maybe not so visible at the first sight. So here we see also gravity force, we talked about that. Okay, delete them. Following the rules, liquid, expand, wave, energy. So maybe now, as I don't have any more ideas to generate from this, maybe apart from making some new connections. So for example, here I saw water, and I thought, okay, can we consider water as a swarm of molecules? This could be an interesting strategy to explore how we can represent fluidity on a different scale through the body physically. Bodies as water molecules. So this is a new idea that was generated because we saw that there were some interesting connections to be made. What are the rules that water particles can follow to become a swarm? When do the waves happen in swarms? How can they transfer energy? So here we have a wave energy transfer. Rules follow. I think it's also important, then what comes to mind is the idea of synchronization in multiplicities. Maybe even on the level of the brain network, because this is how we perceive things, or the insects. There's a lot of studies on this, that in fact they synchronize, and this is what makes them act as an entity. Here is where the networks come in. Okay. Now we can get all the nodes back into the graph. We see the structure is still quite diversified. We have a lot of different topics. They focus around the notions of flow, represent swarm. So now the last stage of this process, now that we have all these ideas represented as a graph, this is already great because we can use it as an overview of what we're thinking about. So if any moment later, let's say I would want to come back to this, I would just click here and have a very nice overview of what I've been thinking about in relation to this subject. And then if I want to generate some new insights, I can go here and follow the advice. Also looking at the latent topical brokers, so the nodes which are not so visible but that are still important. So for example, here, network, make water move. So these are very interesting subjects that I could explore if I want to dig even deeper. And networks is something that I started talking about in the very end, the idea of synchronization of networks. I can even add a new idea and say to link the idea of a liquid entity to the notion of network synchronization. Maybe epidemiological models of rumor propagation, because this is how information spreads, or infection spreads through the network and generates new beliefs. Okay. And then we go just one more step. So then we click on interpret, and here is a nice way to add some more coherent ideas on top of this brainstorm. So in this case, it's going to be, let's say, we look at the graph and we say like, okay, let's cover the main topics and make a concise summary of what we're talking about. You can also, by the way, do it here, but the best way is just to start looking at the graph and at the main topics and to see, okay, so what are we talking about? We're talking about the notion of liquidity. Here, by the way, I made an error, so I'm going to fix this. Just click on this, edit, delete. You can always do that. If you make a typo, the notion of liquidity and how it can be represented in a physical way as a flow. When you see, I'm adding the ideas and they color the graph gray, so they show me how my summary is covering the initial discourse. And then I can say that the notion, maybe let's say like this, a flow can be a reflection of the external forces acting on an entity. The gravity force, impulses, intentions. Another one. A body can show that flow by revealing those forces through movement. Attention and release as the main elements of a wave transfer of energy. From one body to another, and also within the body itself. You see, we're covering almost all the discourse. Now we only have swarm and network left, representing the liquid interaction between the bodies and within the body, using the idea of a swarm. Simple rule-based moving multiplicity, and the network as a representational framework for discussing collective propagation, synchronization, and movement. So here we covered the whole graph, all the most important elements, and this becomes like a summary of the ideas. So if we click here, interpretation overlay, we will see those ideas and how they cover what we've been talking about. So this becomes like a nice starting point that we can use to write the article or to represent all these ideas much more precisely. Maybe it's a paper or just like a text that we can create for ourselves. And also if we click here, we can see what exists in the ideas, but not yet in our interpretation. So we also see that, okay, we didn't talk about water, can be interesting to do that. Didn't talk about how we can change direction and how it can be interesting to show that change of direction in space. And also we can actually reverse this difference comparison, let's say, and then it shows us what we talked about in the interpretation that we didn't talk about in the original idea. So we talk about representational frameworks. This is interesting because we see that the summary became a little bit more conceptual. So this is how it would work. You can go back to the interpretation. You can try it out on Nodus with your own ideas, just using the graph, the analytics panel, some advices that are in the insight panel here, and also just playing with the graph and seeing how you can discover and develop your ideas further using this tool and using network visualization. You can try it on infranodus.com. Thank you.